Welcome everyone and good afternoon. This is the second continuing education session brought to you by Pro-Demnity Insurance Company. We're very pleased you joined us today. We're really delighted to be able to gather with you this year as the OAA conference is an annual mainstay, an opportunity for learning, meeting, networking, exchanging ideas, and it's always a source of inspiration that reinvigorates us. So after a year of disruption and perhaps some continuing discombobulation, it's a real joy to draw some refreshed energy from our community of practice through this conference, which seeks to foster inclusivity and expand perspectives. So as we're waiting for folks to join, we'd love to get a sense of who's in the room. So we're going to pop up a little poll, and we'd ask that you just take a moment and let us know who you are and the experience with which you're joining us today. And as the poll is being broadcast, I'll just note one housekeeping item, which is that this session is being recorded and will be available to attendees after the conference. And that for those attending today, you will be receiving your CE credits directly from the OAA in due course. Okay, let's take a peek here. Okay, I am not seeing any polling results come into me right now, but I'm going to guess that there's a pretty good swath of folks from all different, with all different experiences. So, you know, this is wonderful. So whether you're just starting out in your practice or you're in mid-career or you have a mature practice, we really hope that you pick up some valuable insights in this session about professional liability insurance and managing risk. So as we open this session and meet today on a virtual platform, Pro-Demnity acknowledges the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast and across Turtle Island, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. My name is Ileana Arapis, and I'm the Vice President of Marketing with Pro-Demnity. And on behalf of the entire Pro-Demnity team, we are truly delighted to be a sponsor of the 2021 OAA Virtual Conference. I'm very pleased to introduce and moderate this session on managing risk, what is covered by professional liability insurance and what is not. Your presenters today are Bruce Palmer, President and CEO, Rosemarie Hurst, Vice President, Legal and Claims, and John Hackett, our Vice President of Practice Risk Management. So let's dive right in. By the end of this session, attendees will gain a better understanding of professional liability insurance. We hope you'll increase your familiarity with the coverages included in a professional liability insurance policy, understand the difference between a claims made and an occurrence insurance policy, be aware of some of the common exclusions from coverage and the implications of assuming uninsured risk, and finally, you'll be introduced to some strategies, approaches, and tools suggested by Pro-Demnity to help manage risk arising in practice. Here's how we'll flow through the session today. Bruce will kick things off with an overview of Pro-Demnity and speak about professional liability insurance. Rosemarie will then take a look at the coverage exclusions and some of the claims that do arise. And following Rosemarie, John will offer those practical tools, tips, and tactics that you can immediately apply in your practice to help manage and mitigate risks. We'll then open the floor to a Q&A and close out with some final remarks from Bruce and myself. So something to keep in mind as we progress through the presentation is that we'll be making high-level comments about insurance, and these are intended really to be illustrative. Policy terms and conditions always apply and should be referenced. And I have to say, in the 34 years of protecting and defending architects, we've learned that no two cases are similar. Each claim stands on its own merits, and it's assessed accordingly on a case-by-case basis. At Pro-Demnity, our team is focused on forging stronger and deeper alliances with the architectural practices and firms who are our clients and policyholders. This brief video, entitled "It's All About Alliance," captures our promise to architects.
When you say the word alliance, the definition that comes to mind is two things connecting to be better. But we believe it means so much more. At Pro-Demnity, alliance means everything. It means stronger together. We understand architects because we are insurers and architects. We understand your practice, the rules and risks, so there's a powerful shared connection. It means a collective mission. Pro-Demnity is solely focused on the architectural profession. It's simple. Our purpose is to protect your professional calling. It means working in unison, being in tune with all the parties involved, the environment and the tapestry of client relationships, so all come together in architectural harmony. It means your vision comes to life. When everything aligns, it is deeply gratifying. It's all about taking into account design, the client's needs, and every risk from every angle. We all strive for that same result, beautiful architecture. It means making our profession better. We work to ensure that we educate ourselves and you on risk, so your practice and our business are less vulnerable and continue to be successful. And at the end of the day, it's about protection. We are the architect's ally, and we promise to be the authority on risk, to protect and defend your practice from the financial exposures of a claim, freeing you to focus on design for the built environment. I'm Bruce Palmer, CEO at Pro-Demnity, and we are your alliance for protection.
Bruce, over to you.
Thanks very much, Juliana. I'm Bruce Palmer, and like it says in the video, I am President and CEO at Pro-Demnity. We truly are your alliance for protection, and we take the responsibility to serve architects, both with a lot of pride because we very much enjoy the work you do, but in terms of protecting and defending you from the risks associated with practice, from being your authority on risk and your protective risk ally, we take those responsibilities very importantly. And an important part of that is actually helping educate you around risk management and insurance, not to make decisions for you, but to help you make decisions, to help you understand the risks that you're taking and the consequences of those decisions that you make, and then ultimately to choose wisely as you practice your profession. So to do that, to that end, what I'm going to do today is take you through a little bit of how to start, a little bit of what insurance is, how it works, and ultimately how do we work our way through practice. So Pro-Demnity Insurance, although we are exactly what it says here, we're a licensed insurance company, we're a wholly owned subsidiary of the Ontario Association of Architects. Really what we think of ourselves as three different offerings for architects. First and foremost is our insurance solutions. This goes back to the reason we were created. We're dedicated to reducing the financial insecurity around being a practice, making sure that you have the professional liability insurance you need, not only to practice, but to protect the public. Equally important are our risk alliance legs, our risk education and our risk services components. Risk education, which is sessions like this where we help architects understand practice or understand risk management in their practice, and really help build on our experience over the last 34 years in terms of how do we help architects make good decisions. And our risk services, where it's more personalized information, a lot of times talking with the people you see here on the line with me, Rosemary and John and the rest of our team, the claims and legal team. So we really see ourselves as an alliance of professional services for you. We are very much a purpose-built organization. If you go back to 1986, when the concept of what was then the OAA Indemnity Plan was put forward, it was really about making sure that architects stayed in control of their own business, that they could actually make sure that they took the innovative decisions they made around design and implementing practices, and we remain true to that. So we really do see ourselves as the trusted ally to protect and defend the architectural profession and their families. By strengthening and supporting their resiliency to the risks associated with practice. We truly believe that risk is an inherent part of architecture and an important part of architecture. You can't try innovative designs and new techniques if you aren't prepared to take some risks. So our job is to help support you with that. And to that end, we strive every day to be the authority on risk so that you can count on us for good advice and good input, resulting in financially sustainable practices, unleashing the full potential of the profession to improve human interaction through better design. So let's talk a little bit about insurance. And I've been in the insurance business for 30-ish years. I could talk all day about insurance. I'm not going to. You have a lot of different types of insurance in your business. Life insurance, so you're popping yourself, your employees, property insurance, general liability, auto insurance. What we're going to talk about today, of course, is our favorite type, which is professional liability insurance. And we're going to talk a little bit about why you need it and how do we actually help defend you. Professional liability insurance goes by a number of different names. PLI is a common abbreviation of professional liability insurance, but it also gets called E&O, or errors and omissions. Malpractice, we don't hear as much as we used to, but that's another term that often gets used. And professional indemnity, if you're talking to folks from the UK a lot, they refer to it as professional indemnity rather than professional liability, but they all refer to the same fundamental types of insurance. So one of the things that first struck me when I got into the insurance business was like, how does this actually make any sense? What sane organization would put literally millions of dollars at risk in return for a few thousands of dollars worth of premium? And to really understand insurance, you just all you need to do is think back about 5,000 years to the early days. The first forms of insurance recorded go back to ancient Babylonian and Chinese traders who engaged in the course of trade. They were obviously shipping things by ship back in those days, had to cross water. And it didn't take very long before they realized that all of the traders collectively did better when they shared risk than if they forced any one person to risk everything. So if a ship was lost or a ship was imperiled and they had to take action to save the rest of the crew and the rest of the cargo, everybody benefited by sharing that risk rather than any one person losing everything. And for those of you who are interested in history, the first actual written documents around insurance date back about 3,700 years ago. So insurance has been around for a while, and it hasn't changed much, at least in practice, or at least in the concept around insurance. It's still the same. Insurance is a contract between an individual or entity where they receive financial protection or reimbursement from an insurance company. The company pools those risks to make them affordable, and everyone pays a little, so nobody pays a lot. So that's still the very fundamental nature of how insurance works. And so when you look at professional insurance, liability insurance for architects in Ontario, it's the pool of Ontario architects coming together to protect themselves. And in insurance lingo, when you actually look at a policy and look at how it's actually written, and I've tried to color code it a little bit so you can join the dots. In return for the payment of a stipulated premium, that's the little bit that everybody pays. The insurer, that's us, Pro-Demnity, agrees to indemnify, which is just a short form for saying we offer you the financial protection and we'll reimburse you. To the insured, that's you or your practice, from damage to property if we were a property policy, but in our case, for your liability, for your insured's liability for damage or injury to others, subject always, as Ileana said at the very beginning, to the terms and conditions of our policy. And in insurance, the contract between us, we call it a policy. But fundamentally, it's the same kind of contract that you sign all the time, hopefully after talking to John and Rosemary first. So professional liability insurance specifically is a little bit different in a number of ways from some of your other policies. First, the whole reason it exists is because your general liability, the thing that covers you if somebody walks into your front office and slips on your carpeting, it has a specific exclusion for professional services. So it covers you for everything except for the work that you do. And that's obviously not a good place to be. So that's why professional liability insurance exists, to fill that gap. It is specifically meant to cover the professional liability of architects. And it covers you against actual and alleged errors and omissions committed during the usual and customary provision of architectural services. Rosemary will talk more about claims, so I'm not going to go into it too much, but if you look at the components of claims, there's two components of those costs. First is a defense. So whenever somebody accuses you of something, it's very prudent to make a defense. We cover those costs. And whether it's hiring a lawyer to write an email or to go to court with you, we look after those costs. And those are increasingly substantial portion of our total claims cost. About 70 cents of every dollar we spent in claims goes towards the defense of claims. The second part of it is damages, and those are either negotiated or court-ordered damages that actually are covering what you're alleged to have done wrong or not done right, depending on the case. And we will pay, there may also be some other costs awarded that you have to pay for, and we pay for those. They amount to about 30 cents out of every dollars. Ultimately, professional liability insurance to make sure that we have your back so that you can actually continue to sleep at night, you can continue to design, you can continue to run your practice. One of the common questions we get about insurance is the distinction between coverage and limits. And it's made worse because people in the insurance business tend not to be very precise about how they talk. And so they often talk about coverage when they really mean limits, and they'll talk about limits when they really mean coverage. But when you read your policy, coverage is what is covered, and limits are how much is covered. So the real first question is it covered? And that's a coverage question. So your professional liability insurance covers the professional liability of architects. It covers you and any liability that you incur in the provision of your services. So that's the what. The limit is how much will we pay. And on our Pro-Demnity policy, there's actually 3 different limits that are of value to you. And then there's one thing that's kind of unlimited. That's even perhaps of more value to you. So for any one claim, you'll see on your declarations, on your certificate page, there's a per claim limit. It might be 250,000, it might be $1 million. And often people think of that as the policy limit, but we also have a project limit that is twice that limit. So that's the most that we'll pay for any claims that come from any one project. So whether it's 10 claims or 2 claims or 1 claim, that's the maximum we'll pay. And then in any one policy year, the aggregate limit is the most that we'll pay out in total for all of the damages that are incurred from all of the claims that happen during that year. And that's 4 times the limit. Those are really unusual and unique. When you look around the insurance industry, I'm going to say no other policies do that. If you do enough research, there might be one out there somewhere. Certainly on the architectural professional liability side, these are very unique limits to be able to get an aggregate of 4 times. It protects both you and your client. It means that your limits don't get used up. In insurance terms, we say they get exhausted. Something we're used to in the pandemic is getting exhausted. So we don't exhaust your limits by any one claim or any one project. You always have more coverage available. And the unlimited part of your coverage is around damages. So I talked about or around defense costs rather. Sorry, damages are limited to those claims. Defense costs are those things that are paid in addition to your damages. So if we pay $100,000 in damages, we may incur $200,000 in legal fees and all those other expenses. They're unlimited. They're in addition to your actual claim limit. And this is a good thing for you. Again, it makes sure that you don't use up all your money in defense, so that if there is a claim against you and a damage due, we still have money to pay for it. So when do you have a liability exposure? Really, the short answer is whenever you're a professional architect doing something usual and customary to being an architect. So, if you're out on the tennis court and you hit somebody with your tennis racket, this isn't the policy that will coverage. You might have coverage under some other policy. But if you're doing anything that's associated with the practice of architecture, this is the policy that's going to actually defend you. And we think of things as having both time and who you might do damage to. So if you look at 4 phases when you're going to actually incur some risk. First is the design phase. So when you sign the contract with your client and you start doing design, you actually start to incur risk at that point. If your risk is wrong, that'll manifest itself later on. But if you're late or you start calling delays and allegations of doing things wrong, when you get into construction, obviously there's more risk involved there because you start to interact with other parties, and it's no longer just your client. You now have all of the other people involved in the project who you might have be causing some harm to. After the project is finished in Ontario, there's a limitations period generally of 2 years. There are exceptions to that 2 years, but generally that's when you see the bulk of the claims come through, is in that next 2-year period. And then the final period is the forever thereafter period. In theory, that's limited to 15 years. There is a 15-year ultimate limitation period in Ontario. But even within that, there are exclusions. And the one that's probably of most interest to architects is there are some environmental claims that are excluded from that 15-year exclusion. So when you're an architect, you actually have an exposure going well into the future. The claims we see today are the work you did in the past. The work you're doing today is going to cause the claims of the future. The final thing I'm going to make note of on this page is that the amount of liability exposure you have is really unrelated in some cases to the size of the project you're working on. And so the easiest example to think of, if I fall down a flight of stairs and I seriously injure myself, whether that flight of stairs is part of a $10,000 home renovation or a $100 million office complex, I have the same claim. I have the same injury. I have the same damage. I'm going to sue you for the same amount of money. I don't care, as the person who got hurt, how much money you got paid to design those stairs. I'm going to make an allegation that there was something wrong with those stairs, and that's why I fell. So that's why you'll see there is some rationale sometimes around some of the claims limits we see. Not always, but there is certainly something. It's not just the size of the project that drives your liability exposure. I mentioned that time matters. I'm just quickly going to talk a little bit about occurrence versus claims made. Most of the policies you buy in life will be occurrence policies. So that means that the policies in effect on the day the incident happens is the policy that pays the claims. You have a car accident today, it's today's car accident policy, the auto insurance policy that pays for the damage. Liability insurance, professional liability insurance policies are different. They're what we call claims-made policies. And that means that the policy that's in force on the day that you report the claim or become aware of the claim is the policy that will cover you. And the easiest way to think of it is an example. So I have an example here on the page. If you imagine you had a policy that started last May 18th and it expires today, and its limit is $500,000. Tomorrow you have a new policy starting and you decided to increase your limits to $1 million. And let's just imagine that it's a very unrealistic example, but it makes life easy to understand that I do something wrong this afternoon and it becomes immediately obvious that my error is about to trigger $1 million loss. It's usually a much more complicated process and takes longer to figure that out, but for simplicity, let's say that. Tomorrow morning, I'm blissfully aware of this error I did. I go to bed, sleep well, wake up in the morning, the phone rings, and my client is telling me all about this claim and is saying, hey, we have a problem. Naturally, I pick up the phone, I call Pro-Demnity because that's what good architects do when they get calls like that. The question now is, how much limit is available? I did something wrong today. The client called me tomorrow and I called Pro-Demnity right away. In this case, it's $1 million because even though the event that happened today happened while you have a $500,000 policy happening in force, by the time it was reported to you and you reported it to us tomorrow, it's $1 million because your limit went up at midnight. Now, it's never that simplistic. And that's actually one of the reasons why liability policies are claims made or are not occurrence based. It's very difficult in professional liability to actually identify when it's usually very difficult to identify when the specific event happened or when the omission happened. Like, what day was it that you didn't do the thing that you were alleged not to have done? Well, all of the days are the days I didn't do that by definition. It's often takes a long time to actually identify how much of what that damage is arising from a claim. And because we have that 15-year period, that ultimate limitations period, and perhaps even longer into the future, you always want to make sure that you have future dollars to pay for future claims. You don't want to be stuck when somebody sues you 15 years from now worrying about what your limits were 15 years ago. You want today's policy to look after it. You also, from a very practical point of view, don't want to have to go back and try and find the wording from 15 years ago and try to figure out what your coverage actually said back then. So that's why we use a claims-made policy in professional liability insurance. So why do you actually need all of this? Why as an architect, like, you didn't get into business to buy insurance, why do you have to buy it? The first reason is because architects make mistakes. No matter how good you are, over your lifetime, at some point, you're going to make at least one mistake, perhaps more. Most of the mistakes you're going to catch, and they're not going to mean anything. Every now and then the mistake doesn't get caught and it means something. That's one of the reasons you need liability insurance. The second reason is that even if you don't make a mistake, because you're so central to everything that happens, you're going to get blamed and sued, even when stuff that isn't your fault happens. And, and one of the realities we see increasingly complicated and complex projects, increasing dollar values. You put enough zeros after a number and people start looking for other people to ante up and help pay for it, regardless of what your relationship is. So we know that architects get sued, sometimes through no fault of their own. The third reason, a very fundamental reason that Pro-Demnity was created is because in order to practice, you have to buy it. It says so in the Architects Act. And so Pro-Demnity was created to make sure that all architects could access liability insurance. The market back in 1986 and 87 was actually prohibitive, and many architects were not able to buy insurance. That fundamentally came back to why we were created, is make sure everybody could actually get access to insurance on an equal basis, regardless of your experience, regardless of your size. And the final reason is that for all those first three reasons you might not stay in business if you don't have professional liability insurance. For most of us, our average claim takes 5 to 7 years to settle once it hits the litigation stage. For most of us, that time and that effort, that amount of money involved, frankly, would either destroy our business or severely harm our business. So very quickly, the type of policies, and these are all kind of twists on the same idea. Policies number 1 and 4 are the basic policies that you buy from us. Policy 1 covers you up for $250,000. So that's the, depending on the size of your practice, you have different mandatory limits. But if you need $250,000 and you just need coverage in Canada, then policy 1 is for you. Everything else goes to policy 4. Easy way to think about it. If it's more than $250,000 or you need coverage for a jurisdiction outside of Canada, then you need to move to policy 4. But fundamentally, policy 1 and 4 are very similar. Spike up is a cool idea that Pro-Demnity created a few years ago. So what we see on projects is you'll sometimes have a client or a project that has a need for a limit higher than what you carry in your annual practice coverage. And so you could increase your annual practice coverage, but Spike Up actually allows you to increase your coverage just for that project and just for that client. And it gives you a cost-effective way of doing that. And finally, one of the things with the claims made policy is because you need a policy in force at the time claims are made, you actually need to keep insurance in force forever. And so we make that easy for you. So when you retire from practice, subject to some eligibility requirements, and they're pretty basic requirements. Like you have to have been a member of the OAA and you have to have been insured for a couple of years, and you can't owe us money. But assuming you meet those requirements, we offer you an annual policy of $250,000 a year every year for the rest of your life, plus 6 years. Plus, so it protects your estate, because we do have the occasional claim that takes that long to settle. So we make sure that you can actually retire and enjoy your life's work without having to worry about getting sued every morning when you wake up. So before I turn it over to Rosemary, we have a poll for you. And so I think hopefully our poll will come up for us, and we'll see how well you've been listening. So which of the following does your professional liability insurance cover? So an exterior wall, any type of exterior wall, a specific type of construction system, EIFS, mass timber, whatever, a type of roofing product or waterproofing assembly, so spray-on foundation waterproofing. For those of you who've been following Grenfell Towers, aluminum composite panels, naturally with a fire-resistive core. A brand new product, new on the market, you might not have used before. Is that covered by the policy? Option F, all of the above. So they're all covered. And option G, none of the above. None of those things above are covered. So we'll give you some time. I'm going to turn it over to Rosemary. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Rosemary take over her screen. Thank you all. I look forward to talking to you soon.
As Rosemary's pulling her screen up, just wanted to take a quick look at the poll. And it's a little small for me to see, but it looks like a lot of participants have clicked on, and I might be wrong on this because I can't see it very well. Patrick, maybe you could tell me. All of the above. 70% of people said all of the above. All right, Rosemary, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rosemary Hurst. It's a pleasure to meet you virtually and speak with you this afternoon. I oversee the Claims and Legal Department at Pro-Demnity, and I started our in-house legal department a few years ago. We thought this question would be a good segue into my segment of the presentation focusing on claims. So let's take a look at the question again. Which of the following does my Pro-Demnity professional liability insurance cover? I guess it was a bit of a trick question. The correct answer is none of the above. Things are not covered. Coverage applies to the liability of a person, that is the architect who assumes professional responsibility for advice, recommendations, or design of any of the above. Remember that the architect is protected from allegations that relate to its services because Pro-Demnity is the architect's protective ally. Now, be mindful that conditions of the policy always apply, and therefore there may be exclusions or limitations to your coverage. The takeaway here is that reading your policy is certainly a good thing. Your policy provides 3 key benefits: claims expenses, which includes defense costs, as Bruce had mentioned earlier, damages, and other expenses. I'm going to focus on damages here. Damages could include things such as extra costs, which could be either that of the contractor due to delays caused by the architect during construction, or even legal costs incurred by the owner and contractor due to omissions in the construction documents. It could also include costs to repair or replace faulty systems or components due to the architect's design error or omissions in the construction documents, or the architect's failure to recognize faulty construction. It can also include costs of professional services incurred by the owner by their failure to identify or repair faulty design by the architect. Perhaps there could be something missed by the architect. Then there's legal costs. Now, this is different from the defense costs that Bruce had mentioned earlier. There could be legal costs incurred by the owner or the contractor, and that would make up part of the claims expenses. That would be part of the damages. And the last point here is personal injury. Now, personal injury is quite different from the damages that we see in traditional construction litigation, as it could include things less tangible, such as pain and suffering. What is not covered? There is no coverage for any indemnity obligation an architect agrees to in contract with a client. Any obligations that the architect agrees to that exceed what would have already applied at law would not be covered. A common example would be an obligation to defend a client or any claim or litigation that might arise related to the architect's services. Another thing that's not covered: the name or title. Commonly we see construction manager or project manager, under which an architect opts to deliver construction. That could affect coverage. What is not covered? Fee disputes. That is something that we commonly see in both the claims and legal department. I do have words of advice in this regard. Don't let unpaid accounts build up. Insist upon regular and prompt payment. Deal with changes in the agreed scope of services and your expectation of additional fees promptly before you do the work. Also, do not provide services without a written agreement covering the scope of services to be provided and fees to be paid, even if it's with a client that you've had a long-standing business relationship. If it's not reduced to writing, there could be issues in the event of a claim. What is excluded from your Pro-Demnity policy coverage? Your professional liability policy contains a few exclusions and limitations. Now, the exclusions listed here are exclusions that commonly apply to the claims we received. For example, 1D applies to your delay in providing architectural services. The perils of exclusion 1F cannot be understated. That's services that are not usual or customary. Again, that goes to activities such as construction management. As I mentioned earlier, it could be excluded from coverage. Exclusion number 5 is where you may have arranged, or your client may have arranged for you to be named as an additional insured on their policy. And exclusion 7 would apply to scenarios where, for example, you agreed to arbitration. This would affect Pro-Demnity's right of recovery. These are just a few of the exclusions in the policy. As with any insurance, there are always exclusions and limitations. So please, I can't impress upon you enough to review your policy and the endorsements. In fact, reading your professional liability policy qualifies as self-directed continuing education credit. Now, what is a claim? A claim could arise in many circumstances. It could be a demand for money or services, an allegation that you either breached or failed to provide architectural services, an allegation that there was negligence or an error. Then there's the fourth category, which is a bit of a gray area and triggers many calls from architects seeking advice. That is circumstances that might give rise to a claim. And these types of circumstances could include a troubled project where the contractor is alleging extras are due to design issues in the contract documents. A contractor is alleging your actions or inaction have caused a delay. An owner or client complains about the number or amount of change orders that had initially not been contemplated. Again, recognizing a claim. It comes up in many forms, and this could include a delay that would result in added costs, as I had mentioned earlier, building failure or replacement, failure to repair or replace something. And there's damages by two third parties, and that's a typical property damage or personal injury scenario, or known design failure on another building with the same design. So that's a repeated error. What does a claim look like? A demand for money or services, a dispute between third parties, or a notice of a legal proceeding, such as a statement of claim. Now, I hope that many of you have never had the misfortune of having been involved in litigation. But here is what a typical statement of claim would look like. If you receive one of these, even if you or your firm isn't specifically named, but you had some involvement in the project reference, please notify Pro-Demnity immediately, and we can provide you with the guidance in terms of what the next steps would be. The architect's obligations in the event of a claim. A few things that you must do. Please notify us. Prompt notification to Pro-Demnity is really important here. Cooperation. Your cooperation could come in many forms. It could be attending meetings, telephone calls, reviewing documents, providing documents, and this would all be at your own time and expense. Follow through. Perhaps you're required to pay a deductible in order to see through a claim. Just follow through on that. What you must not do. Please never admit responsibility. Don't make any admissions, even if you know there may have been some wrongdoing on your part. Just contact Pro-Demnity and we can walk you through the process and figure out the best way to handle your issue. Please don't ever do anything to imperil Pro-Demnity's rights of recovery. If in doubt, please call us. There is no penalty for reporting a claim. It's not like auto insurance where you'll get points or your premium will be affected. Pick up the phone, call, and we can walk you through the process and provide you with some guidance. It may not even be a claim, but it's best to run it by us and we can help you to navigate the process. In fact, failure to report a claim promptly could even put your coverage in jeopardy. Now, there are a few common issues that show up in claims. One that we see frequently, it's design errors, and that could come in the form of exterior walls and roofs, poor performance or code violations, disregard of envelope consultants' advice, the disregard of basic science, grading errors, engineers' errors or omissions. Now remember, there's architects' contractual liability for engineering sub-consultants. Perhaps it could be a failure to coordinate. A thin field review service, that's something that we do see frequently in the claims department. That would be situations such as the architect is just not on site enough to see and comment on important issues, or the failure to recognize or address issues when on site. It could also be the client's attitude. Perhaps the client and the architect's interests are not aligned with the public interest. Perhaps the architect has insufficient resources, such as not enough time to dedicate to field review. Or simply, there are just communication gaps. What can an architect do to protect their practice? Just by the nature of the work that you're involved in, as Bruce noted earlier, no matter how great an architect you are, there is nothing you can do to avoid someone pointing the finger at you when things go wrong on a project. Regardless of the nature of the project, you can be faced with a tort claim, or any claim for that matter. You could find yourself involved in a personal injury action from a project where you received a modest fee a number of years ago, and then find yourself in this multi-million-dollar lawsuit resulting in a catastrophic loss. While you cannot prevent claims, there are many things that you can do to reduce the probability of claims and the severity of claims. You can always call one of our claims professionals to support you or provide you with guidance in the event of a claim. But to possibly avoid claims, please take advantage of the many resources available to you through our risk services department. And now over to John, who will walk us through what architects can do to reduce the probability of claims or reduce the severity of claims that they are involved in.
As John is bringing up his screen, I wanted to do or intersect for a very quick Q&A relating back to Bruce's presentation. So we have a couple of questions that have already come in with respect to the statute of limitations. And the first one is from Cynthia. So should I keep all project files forever just in case?
Well, so I'm hoping Rosemarie is going to chime in and help me on this. So I think, you know, you need to keep the key documents. I think you actually do. And as we move electronically, it becomes a little bit easier, both easier and harder. One of the biggest challenges we have on claims now is just the sheer number of documents. All those emails you wrote back and forth are all discoverable and all get entered into evidence. So I'm going to ask Rosemarie. We certainly keep a lot of our records for a long time. I'm going to ask Rosemarie for a legal answer on this one, if she has an opinion on what the right answer might be if she takes good.
Sure, thank you, Bruce. So yes, you do have to keep your documents and they are discoverable, but it may not, I would say going back 10 years or beyond. But it is required that you have the project documents for the past 10 years, because it does come up in litigation where you're required to turn those documents over. With that being in mind, be careful what you say and do in emails. All of those emails exchanged back and forth on a project, they can all be the subject of a lawsuit, and there could be some admission of wrongdoing. I've seen it several times. So even though it's all very casual and very friendly, remember that these documents could in fact be used in litigation. So do be wary of, or at least be very careful with how you phrase your emails and what information you provide. But by the same token, do document everything, because those casual conversations not reduced to writing, you don't have really a leg to stand on, and it could be an evidentiary issue.
That's terrific. Thank you, Rosemary. And now over to John.
I'm very hopeful that you are seeing my screen. So what can an architect, I'm sorry, I just jumped ahead there. Thank you very much, Rosemary, and I hope I've managed to accept the baton. We've got a number of items that we have included in this list of 25, certainly merit more discussion than we'll be able to provide today. So consider these a preview of future programs. None of the 25 are a solution in their own. Essentially, we're providing you a checklist, really a series of reminders of good practice that sometimes we can overlook in the daily pressure of getting things done. Number one is number one. Architects are professionals. An adequate scope of services is critical to the delivery of our professional services. Many claims against architects can be traced back to an inadequate scope of services that simply doesn't reflect the architect's obligation as a professional to meet our duty of care to a client and to the public interest. And number two is also essential. If you and your subconsultants aren't adequately compensated for your time and professional expertise in order to meet your professional obligations, you won't survive as a professional business. Many claims, many architects start out with unreasonable expectations. Our job as professionals is to manage, often change those expectations to reflect what is reasonable in your professional opinion. An unreasonable schedule that requires you to scrimp on your services means things are left out. Errors aren't going to be caught. These result in claims. An unreasonable budget is another recipe for claims. A claim that the architect failed to meet the client's needs. We didn't deliver the house that we promised to deliver for whatever budget the client had. And too often these both go together. Question of code compliance. We are allowed to recommend exceeding the minimum provisions in the building code. However, we must be sure, or you must be sure, that you discuss the issues, both the pros and cons of doing so, with the client before you opt to exceed the current code requirements. You need to keep a record in writing that you did discuss the matter with the client, record the client's agreement or non-agreement with the measures that exceed the code in writing. I learned this at firsthand when a retired judge who was acting as the mediator in a claim pointed out to me that although the measures to increase the accessibility features in a home for the aged, a retirement home, although they were made every good sense, the fact that the client had not had the opportunity to say yes to them meant that they had the right to claim for the additional costs. 5 and 6 really follow the last slide. These are logical risk management response when a client's expectations are unreasonable, in your opinion, and can't be changed. Saying no, that doesn't work for me is the strongest negotiating tool in any professional's toolbox. And willingness to recognize red flags and walk away from a potential project are watersheds for many practices, and it's very tough to do. But the ability to say no, the willingness to say no, is also evidence of an active risk management culture. There's also the rationale that if I don't agree to the client's unfair and unreasonable expectations, some other architect will get the work. It's probably the opposite. You may be absolutely correct that one of your professional colleagues won't see things the same way you do. But whenever you find yourself using this logic, stop and think again, please. Imagining what another architect might do is not a smart way to make your own decisions. And 5 and 6 can also apply to unfair and unreasonable requests for proposals. If an unfair and unreasonable RFP doesn't attract responses from architects, those who are issuing the RFPs will eventually catch on. And from time to time, that does happen. The OAA issues practice alerts, but if members of the OAA ignore the alerts, respond to the RFPs, architects are actually sabotaging the OAA's efforts on our collective behalf. Some of you, well, those of you who may be as old as I am, may remember a comic strip, Pogo. I have seen the enemy and it is us, a memorable phrase. Number 4, remember the adage that he who acts as his own lawyer has a fool for a client, with apologies to those of you who practice amateur law. Number 7 could be number 1 from a risk management perspective. As professionals, we are held to a higher standard, including the maintenance of adequate records and documentation. All of our discussions and recommendations to clients and the client's responses, our advice and warnings about the implications of a client's decisions, discussions with other consultants or authorities, all of these need to be recorded in writing. And if a claim does arise on a project, the quality of your records can be a powerful influence on how a judge assesses whether you have met your obligations as a professional. And number 8 and 9 are really part of the same package. Number 10, use smart contracts. Smart contracts are, by my definition at least, contract wordings that provided by the profession specifically for the provision of architectural services and for those of our subconsultants, and or are written by your own lawyer. Good examples, OAA documents 600, 800, 900, RAIC 6, all of them have their own features, but all of them have been written to serve your interests as professionals. Corollary, what's a dumb contract? Anything you write yourself. Go back to point number 4. Remember that thing about a lawyer, acting as your own lawyer. And another one is anything provided by a subconsultant, often disguised as standard terms and conditions, which are in fine print on the back of a fee proposal or attached to a fee proposal. Numbers 11 and 12 simply continue the discussion of the preceding slide, but number 13 merits a few extra minutes of discussion. One of the most common issues we see are client-authored indemnification provisions. Rosemary mentioned them as one of the things that aren't covered. The large majority of these client-authored contract provisions are devising for transferring client risk onto the architect. And wordings that impose indemnity obligations on the architect will not be covered by professional liability insurance. Now, silence in the contract respecting your indemnity obligations doesn't let you off the hook. The law already recognizes indemnity obligations to a client. Those are what are covered by your professional liability insurance. Now, this isn't specific to Pro-Demnity. Infrastructure Ontario spent a long time convincing themselves that this was only Pro-Demnity, only architects who held this view. But no, every professional liability insurer will exclude obligations assumed by the insurer in a contract. It's also the area where Pro-Demnity has provided the most advice over the past decade and a half, also through bulletins and seminars, as well as individual responses to architects. Two good available fixes are the notwithstanding clause, which has been available, advertised, marketed to you, provided to you in all sorts of forms since 2006. And most recently, starting in 2017, also a benign indemnification wording. Both of these have their place. Both are available from the Pro-Demnity website. What else can an architect do? Well, this particular group, this slide may all appear to be common sense, and they are, but they are worth a reminder. A go, no-go checklist is an important tool for adding some discipline to your efforts to secure new work. The OAA's Fundamentals of Managing an Architectural Practice program includes a unit explaining some of the factors that help you evaluate which projects and types of clients are going to be a good fit with your own interests, capabilities, and your own aspirations. Trust me, not every client and not every is a good client for you. You can use a go, no-go evaluation to help avoid a lot of wasted time and energy. And you can include some of the red flags that are essential for a risk management culture. Number 17, you'll see the note repeating Rosemary's advice that reading your professional liability policy counts as self-directed Con Ed points. I'd go on to add that you might add that the slower and more carefully you read it, and the more notes you take, the more Post-it notes you stick on the side, the more Con Ed credit you can qualify for. And number 18 is very important. Many claims allege the architect failed to adequately coordinate the services of the design team, and too often that allegation will have some truth. We architects promote our profession as the logical, best equipped to coordinate the services of all of the professionals on a design project. If we're going to hold that view, we need to actually do the work. Sometimes we don't. Reviewing a consultant's invoice before paying it certainly isn't enough to qualify as a serious effort at coordinating the work of the professionals. And too often, the failure to coordinate may be traced back to items 1 and 2, inadequate scope and inadequate fees to allow you to do it properly. Number 19, recognizing your limitations is not a sign of weakness. These three types of consultants are very helpful to help you address high-risk areas that do show up in claims, building envelope, highest cost category for claims, building code, very common source of claims. If you fail to hit the minimum hurdle, cross the minimum hurdle established by the building code, you're out of luck. You don't meet the standard of care if you don't at least meet that absolute minimum hurdle. And costs, no matter what a client tells you, costs are important to them, and they are dependent on us as a profession, you as their architect, to respect their dollars. Number 20 can well, being helpful can prove fatal. Be very careful to not become a procurement service on behalf of a client. There are any number of clients who will come to you and say, look, yeah, we really know that we shouldn't be asking you to hire hazardous material specialists, but it is such a painful process for us to go through another RFP and to have to qualify them. And, you know, our procurement department are terrible to deal with. Really good if you would just stand in help, and we've already got a contract with you. We'll just add it to your scope. Okay? Well, no, it's not okay. You will assume contractual liability, as Rosemary pointed out. You'll assume contractual liability for any specialist you retain as a subconsultant, including those that don't really have anything to do with the services you're providing. Now, some consultants make sense. Those that are contributing to your professional services, structural engineers, mechanical, electrical, for decades, those have been commonly retained by architects, certainly in certain areas of practice, publicly funded institutional work, for example. But others don't make sense. Security, particularly when you're not allowed to know what the security measures that the security consultant is recommending are. We've had a claim like that. Information technology, that consultant deals directly with the client. Their advice is provided to the client. The decisions are made by the client. What you need is just the conduit and the outlets. In fact, what is required to provide the infrastructure to accommodate the IT. Another one that's a favorite that Infrastructure Ontario came up with is moving consultant. Now these are specialists that advise the client directly. And services provided by some specialists can fall outside the usual and customary services of an architect. Another opportunity for extensive discussion someday. Rosemary mentioned construction phase services. This is, we don't have time to really address this to any extent, but construction phase and contracted admin services provided by an architect are a major source of claims against architects, more specifically inadequate. There are a handful of things that show up, but one, for instance, would be an architect who are operating as the consultant under a CCDC form of agreement. The CCDC form describes what a consultant is supposed to do. It also says what it's not supposed to do. But one of the things that pops up from time to time is the architect forgetting that when they're the consultant, they are a neutral referee, and that they must, and it's also a regulatory requirement under the OAA, they must, in filling that role, they must show preference to neither the client nor the contractor, even though the owner is paying their bills. The home team may pay for the referee, but the referee still has to call the shots as they see them. Some very general principles. First of all, take control of your practice. It summarizes a lot of what we've been talking about here. Take charge of your practice so that you don't become a victim. Yeah, learn to say no. Number 23 and 24, a quality assurance program that you can describe and adhere to can be a powerful marketing tool that sets your firm apart from the competition. It's also a powerful risk management tool. It can save you dollars, problems, and certainly reduce your exposure to claims. And finally, number 25, you can learn from the experience of your less fortunate colleagues. This claims experience workbook is available, and it's a great resource, particularly if you want to avoid some of the experiences of your colleagues. It's available as a PDF from the Pro-Demnity website, but very, very importantly, it is also available at Pro-Demnity's virtual booth at this conference, and we look forward to your accessing it. It includes checklists, among other things, that you can use as part of your quality assurance program, or to help you get started on one. At this point, I have to remember, first of all, I'm going to try to turn it over to Ileana, and the first thing I have to do, God willing, is stop sharing. Did that work?
It sure did, John. Thank you so very much. And let me see if I can actually start sharing my screen. That will be quite a wonderful thing to have happen as well. Okay. Now I am guessing, because I can't even see my show taskbar here. Okay. All right, well, this slide won't come up for me, but that's okay, folks, because we're going to launch into the Q&A. And as I wait for a few of the questions to roll in, I just wanted to remind us of the learning objectives today. So Bruce explained what professional liability insurance is and why it's required, as well as shared with us the coverages that are included in such a policy. We also covered the difference between a claims made and an occurrence insurance policy, and Rosemary walked us through several of those common exclusions and the implications of assuming uninsured risk. And finally, John provided you with some fantastic strategies, 25 of them, approaches and tools suggested by Pro-Demnity to help you manage risks arising in your practice. Okay, let's turn our attention to some of the questions here. And there was one that I saw that really caught my eye. It was a quick one. The question was around foreign jurisdictions. So does Pro-Demnity provide coverage for other countries or jurisdictions? Bruce, I'm going to toss that one to you.
Thank you. And again, I'll encourage Rosemary to correct anything bad that I say, since she's the real lawyer. And I'm mindful of John's advice about being my own client. So under policy 4, yes, we do. There are, so one thing you need to always be aware of whenever you're dealing with a foreign jurisdiction is there are sanctions lists that you're prohibited from doing business in those countries, and we're prohibited from paying claims in those countries. We're always subject to those sanctions lists. But within that respect, we are able to defend you. One particularly noteworthy foreign jurisdiction is the United States, because a lot of people do business in the US. One thing that happens in the US is when you go there, defense costs move within the limit rather than in addition to the limit. So you actually get less coverage in the United States, and that reflects the costs of going to court, frankly, in the US. And the somewhat litigious nature down there, although we seem to be doing our best to keeping up with our southern neighbors.
Terrific, thank you. Here's a question for John. What can we do if an engineer insists on using their own form of contract? We received a fee proposal from one large engineering firm that included a standard contract that the local firm says they are not allowed to alter.
Thank you. That's a question that arises actually several times, and it's becoming increasingly common. There are a number of engineering firms that have acquired a whole host of consulting companies, and several of them have made it somewhat, well, they have their own in-house risk management or legal departments who have proposed that the engineers should sign agreements only that with very serious limitations on that is the subconsultant's liability to the client, and in this case, the client is you. Now, you won't have, the architect is highly unlikely to have a contract upstream with their client, a prime contract, as it were, with a client where their fees or the client's claims against the architect are limited to their fees, or $5,000 or $50,000, some sort of relatively nominal amount. But that's what the subconsultant would like you to agree to in many of these. And, you know, that's just nuts, because you will be filling the gap. You, as Rosemary's pointed out, you will have contractual liability to the client for the errors and omissions of this subconsultant, and the structural or mechanical engineer can be 100% responsible for a very serious claim on a project. However, exclusion 7 under your policy will mean that you essentially have squandered your insurance, because you will have if that provision in the subconsultant agreement held up, you would be precluded, you would have prevented Pro-Demnity from actually claiming back against the consultant for the full amount they should have. The answer is learn to say no. Make sure you are looking after yourself. I hope that covers it.
Thank you so much, John. We have a question that is actually about our insurance. So what is a policy period?
So a policy period is the date from the inception date to the next renewal. It's a year in almost every case, but it's the policy year that the policy runs for.
There's another question here. What would constitute imperiling Pro-Demnity? Rosemary, that was in your presentation. Architects are not to imperil Pro-Demnity in the event of a claim. So over to you.
It would include things such as admissions could potentially imperil Pro-Demnity, trying to fix mistakes yourself, offering to pay money to resolve things without notifying Pro-Demnity, and agreements, acknowledging agreements such as indemnification clauses that could imperil Pro-Demnity. So all of these things could be claims issues or risk management issues. But again, if there's something that you're making commitment to on a project and it could affect your coverage, it could imperil Pro-Demnity. So just be cognizant of that. And I think John can definitely chime in there.
One that is pretty hot at the moment is agreeing to a dispute resolution provision that actually precludes Rosemary and her team from managing the defense that they are required to provide to you. And one of the most current ones that seems to be taking off like a modest pandemic, or at least similar, is binding arbitration. It's a place for arbitration. It's one of several alternate dispute resolutions. But if you sign a contract that requires Rosemary's team to use arbitration, even when it's a really bad choice, that's one of the things that could bite you in a place that hurts.
Thank you, John. We've got a question here that is related to retention of documents, but also retirement. So how long do you keep your documents after you retire?
So, I think the short answer, as Rosemary said, is kind of forever. The way around, part of the sensible way of actually managing this is having a document retention policy. So that if you have a policy where you're going to delete all of your emails after 10 years, But you should always, your core documents are your core documents. Then there's an exposure there forever.
John?
Yep, it's gotten a little bit easier with the, because most documents now are digital, that can be retained digitally, so you're not having a garage or several garages full of rolled up sketch paper and documents. But there's out there, hopefully you can cross your fingers that the 15-year ultimate limitation period will rescue you, perhaps.
Thank you, John. Okay, we have a question around RFPs. And this is a really interesting one. And I think it speaks to our role as the architect's ally. So there are many RFPs calling for unacceptable clauses from public entities. Has Pro-Demnity considered addressing these at conferences held by municipalities, for example, as a way to educate and help revise the contract clauses of these repeat offenders?
The one-word answer is yes, we have. You know, this is actually an area of huge concern, and John and Rosemary deal with it day in and day out, where people make just unrealistic requests. You know, I had a conversation with a lawyer representing a municipality, and I explained to them the dangers of what they were doing and the uninsured nature of what they were asking, and his answer was, "I don't care. My job is to make sure that my municipality takes zero risk, and I'm going to push it on everybody else I can." And it's hard when you're dealing with people who have that attitude to get to a realistic endpoint. I do agree. I think, you know, we've had some discussions internally. The real solution to this is actually to get out and talk to the risk consultants and the lawyers who are drafting those requirements, helping them understand why that is an unreasonable and frankly bad for them. Like, it's not good for any municipality to force liability onto an organization that ultimately will not be able to make good on that. You know, won't have the financial resources. So there is an awful lot of opportunity, I think. It's not going to be a quick win. It's there's a lot of legal reasons and a lot of very real practical reasons why municipalities are looking to move risk away from themselves, both from a regulatory and legislative point of view, and just a reporting to politicians. You don't want to be the civil servant who put your hand up and said, "I accepted that risk." But I think there is an opportunity for us to do some education, and that is on our work plan.
That's right. Thank you, Bruce. We have a question over to Rosemary. Is there a list of lawyers who deal with claims? A little bit about your team.
Yes.
I call them the legal eagles.
Yes, we do actually have a small team of in-house counsel who deal with claims. And then we also have some external counsel who are on our panel that we refer some of our litigated files to. So it's a combination of the two, but yes, we do have resources in-house who support the claims department.
Okay, great question here. How do we avoid the Infrastructure Ontario contract that is the only basis for doing government work? I'm going to toss that over to John.
I sound improved at this point.
It's still a little bit muffled, John. It may in fact be your Wi-Fi.
It's or it may be that I actually can see myself twice on the screen, so that I'm
You're amplified.
Yeah. Actually, there's several versions of Infrastructure Ontario's contracts now. The vendor of record contract got modified with respect to the indemnification wording 3-4 years ago. But otherwise, Infrastructure Ontario, like everyone else, any other client, if you are prepared to say yes to what they're going to offer you, then there's no reason for them to back off. They are very difficult. Most architects are dealing with that vendor of record contract. They've increased the limits required for reasonably modest projects by a very great deal. But there is, to the best of my knowledge and in the versions I've seen, there has been a change made at the OA after prolonged struggle with the OAA.
Thank you, John. Another question for Rosemary. If an exclusion applies to my claim, does it mean my claim will be denied?
The answer is it depends, but no, not outright. Just because there's an exclusion, it could be defended under what we call a reservation of rights. So the entire claim doesn't hang on the one allegation. However, we would defend you with the understanding that a particular exclusion applies, and therefore our coverage and our defense of you would be limited to whatever is covered. So if in fact, let's say, for example, the whole case is about a delay claim and there are no other issues and it's really central, and this very rarely happens, you would get something called a reservation of rights letter letting you know we are defending you, we're not outright denying your claim. However, it's under a reservation of rights because a particular exclusion applies.
Yeah, just to add on that, for those of you who may not have been lucky enough not to have been sued yet, it's very, very unusual that there is only one allegation. There's usually a long list of things you are alleged to have done. And so the reason we do this approach is that if it does turn out to be the whole case rests on that one excluded thing, then that's a different issue. But typically there are other factors involved, and as we work through the negotiation, very few cases actually end up in court these days. As we work through the negotiation process, we will continue to defend you as long as it appears to be coverage in some aspect.
Okay, thank you all. So we've come to the end of our Q&A, and I'd like to thank everybody for your, very thoughtful and thought-provoking questions. We know that we didn't get a chance to answer all of them. Please feel free to drop by our booth, our lovely virtual booth in the conference lounge, and meet with us, or you're welcome to visit our revitalized Pro-Demnity website at pro-demnity.com, and you can also book an appointment with us if you wanted to discuss some of these concerns further. Certainly John is always ready, willing, able, and always looks forward to chatting with architects and learning more about your situations and issues and your thoughts as well. So we're going to move over to closing remarks, and I will hand the mic back over to Bruce.
Thanks very much, Ileana, and I am going to be brief. First, I'd just like to thank all of you for your both for your attendance today and your questions and your interesting questions. I guess I should thank Rosemary for being here to answer the ones I couldn't answer. And more importantly, I would like to thank you for all of your support and your comments. I've been with Pro-Demnity now for 2 years. My second week on my job was attending the OAA conference in Quebec City. So this conference reminds me of my early days, and certainly the support I've received over the last 2 years, and the company has received over the last 3 decades. We truly, we wouldn't be here without you, and we are here just for you. With that in mind, I just kind of like wrap up by reemphasizing what we see our role as. We really do see ourselves as your ally, as an authority on risk, to help you make good decisions. I get asked sometimes, is it like, why can't I accept unlimited liability? Why can't I accept? Well, you can. I can't stop you from doing that. Just remember what that means. If you're accepting unlimited liability, that means you have no insurance, and that everything you've ever built and everything you ever own and everything you ever might own is at risk. And if that's the decision you want to make, that's entirely your decision. Our job is to help you make wise decisions and to understand the consequences of those decisions. There probably are things you would risk everything for, and there's probably a lot of things you wouldn't risk everything for. please stop by our booth. I look forward to seeing you there. And I know I just ruined Ileana's line because I'm not supposed to talk about the booth. But I look forward to seeing you. I look forward to talking to you. Several of you have actually already sent me emails today commenting on our new website. So thank you for that. And I'm going to turn it back to Ileana for the final kind of logistical details.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Rosemary and John, and a big thank you to the participants for your attention this afternoon and for your really great questions. As your professional ally, Pro-Demnity is really here to protect and defend you from the financial exposures of a claim. We're always happy to be of assistance. So once again, please drop by and see us at our virtual booth in the conference lounge, and you can download those additional resources such as the claims workbook and the checklist that John mentioned, among other resources, including our schedule of events at the booth this week. And just of note, on Wednesday and Thursday at 1 o'clock, we will be hosting a Meet the CEO session at our booth where you can have a little bit more FaceTime with Bruce. A final thank you to the OAA, and we really hope that you enjoyed the rest of the conference. Bye from Pro-Demnity.